A Chinese intelligence officer sat in a bare room in a camp south of the Yalu River in the brutal winter of 1951. He was a professional who had been interrogating prisoners of war for 3 grueling months. He had carefully processed Americans, British, Turks, and French soldiers, developing a highly effective system for each demographic. He knew that everyone broke differently under pressure, but ultimately, everyone broke. Every nationality possessed a unique psychological seam, a specific cultural pressure point that you could work your fingers into if you were patient and sufficiently trained. The interrogator had documented these cultural fractures with meticulous academic precision. The Americans were generally loud, responsive to comfort, and eager to negotiate their circumstances. The British were strictly formal, clinging to class structures and readable hierarchies that could be systematically dismantled. The Turkish soldiers were remarkably stoic and physically resilient, but they were still findable through focused isolation techniques. The Chinese lenient policy was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, refined during their civil war and deployed with devastating effectiveness. It relied on offering unexpected warmth and basic human comforts after periods of severe deprivation. This sophisticated approach was incredibly simple in its core concept, but absolutely ruthless in its daily execution. The interrogators were instructed not to brutalize the prisoner or threaten him with immediate physical harm. Instead, they would befriend him, offer him a heated room, provide a cigarette, and gently exploit his profound homesickness. The psychological goal was to find the agonizing gap between what the young soldier missed deeply and what the captors could easily provide. They designed the interrogation to make cooperation feel like overwhelming physical relief rather than a treasonous act of military betrayal. It worked on nearly everyone who walked through that heavy wooden door. Against the American troops, the lenient policy functioned like a surgical scalpel. These young soldiers were overwhelmingly drafted citizens, far from home, who had never expected to fight a freezing war in Korea. After weeks of starvation and paralyzing cold, they responded predictably to a warm room, a friendly face, and an English-speaking officer asking softly about their hometown girls. The overwhelming physiological relief triggered compliance, driven by exploited human nature rather than inherent weakness, managed by experts who understood psychological mechanics flawlessly. When dealing with the British troops, the interrogators adjusted their methodology to exploit the rigid class system of the era. The British carried their social hierarchy directly into the prison camps, and the officers resisted quite differently from the enlisted men. An experienced interrogator could easily identify a British officer within 5 minutes purely by observing his seated posture and defensive mannerisms. Paradoxically, the officers were sometimes easier to break because their ingrained belief in their own importance meant they could be cleverly flattered into revealing significantly more operational information than they ever consciously intended. The enlisted British soldiers were distinctly harder to crack, but they still operated within a predictable psychological framework of deference and structure that the Chinese intelligence officers could decode over time. The interrogator felt completely in control of his environment, confident in his refined techniques and the undeniable historical success of his ideological program. He was willing to sit in that austere room long enough to break any man from any nation. Then the camp guards abruptly changed the established rhythm of his morning schedule. They opened the heavy door and finally brought him an Australian. The intelligence officer calmly opened his notebook and asked the man his name in perfect English. The Australian soldier simply looked at him and said absolutely nothing. The interrogator asked again, expecting the standard initial defiance he had witnessed countless times before. The Australian slowly scratched his jaw, looked casually up at the freezing ceiling, and then looked right back at his captor. "Hot in here, isn't it?" That was the very first thing the captured man said. He offered no name, no military rank, no passionate protest, and absolutely no demand for his rights. It was a mundane comment about the room's temperature, delivered as casually as if he had just wandered into a local pub and found the radiator turned up slightly too high. The interrogator carefully noted this strange behavior in his ledger, decided to move past the initial friction, and asked the man to identify his operational unit. The Australian slightly tilted his head with an expression of mild curiosity. "What unit are you from, mate?" The interrogator blinked in genuine surprise, staring at the scruffy soldier across the table. He had never been asked a question by a prisoner. He had never been questioned quite like that, with such an incredibly casual tone. The vocal delivery was not aggressive, it was not overtly defiant, and it carried no discernible hostility whatsoever. It was entirely conversational. The Australian captive had completely reversed the room's psychological dynamic in exactly 4 seconds without raising his voice, without angrily clenching his fists, and without doing anything that military manuals could formally classify as resistance. He had simply treated the interrogation as a chat between equals, and the interrogator, for the first time in 3 months, did not know what to do next. This bizarre interaction was the Chinese intelligence network's first real taste of a phenomenon they would struggle to define across multiple future conflicts. The sophisticated, lenient policy had suddenly hit an invisible but impenetrable wall. It was not a dramatic wall built of angry shouting, fierce defiance, or organized hunger strikes that guards could violently punish. It was a suffocating wall of absolutely nothing. When the trained interrogators kindly offered physical warmth, the Australians accepted the comfort entirely without gratitude. When they offered premium cigarettes, the Australians smoked them quietly without offering any conversational exchange in return. The entire psychological architecture of the Chinese system relied heavily on creating a deep subconscious debt. Deprivation followed swiftly by unexpected comfort was supposed to create a profound moral obligation that the isolated prisoner felt desperately compelled to repay with military secrets. This delicate architecture collapsed immediately because the Australians simply did not feel the intended debt. They took whatever basic comforts were offered. They gave absolutely nothing back in return, and they did not appear to feel even slightly conflicted or guilty about their behavior. The friendly interrogator was suddenly rendered completely useless and structurally powerless. How could an entirely uncoordinated group of regular soldiers instinctively dismantle a state-sponsored psychological warfare program without any formal training? Get this historical fact perfectly clear from the very start of this analysis. No classified government program produced this unique behavior. No elite military school taught it, and no survival manual ever documented it before it happened. The Americans had their newly developing resistance doctrines, and the British maintained their strict class-based psychological courses. But the Australians possessed something else entirely, an innate characteristic that their own frustrated military leadership deeply struggled to logically explain or formally replicate. This strange defensive mechanism was something their furious enemies would eventually document in bewildered, obsessive detail across 3 different wars and 2 entirely different continents. The Chinese interrogators quickly realized that this incredibly frustrating resistance did not originate from a sterile military classroom or a classified training camp. It was a pervasive cultural virus that infected the entire interrogation process. The enemy was forcing them to fight a psychological war against an entire nation's deeply ingrained social identity. The captive sitting across the table was not just a lone soldier. He was an impenetrable ghost they would later call the Gray Man. This unique resilience did not come from a classified military classroom or an elite training facility hidden away in the capital. It came directly from a worn kitchen table in Wagga Wagga and from a sprawling, sun-baked sheep station west of Broken Hill. It was born in a simple fibro house in Ipswich, where a young kid learned very early that you answer a demanding question with as few words as humanly possible. You never, ever give anyone the profound satisfaction of seeing you rattled, whether it is your school teacher, your wealthy boss, or your strict father. The Chinese intelligence officers knew something was fundamentally different about these specific captives. One senior Chinese officer described this baffling phenomenon in a detailed field report that miraculously survived the final armistice. The recovered document was translated at the Australian Army's Intelligence Centre in Melbourne, revealing deep enemy frustration. The officer wrote that American prisoners displayed a highly predictable emotional spectrum, moving from resistance to negotiation, then partial cooperation, and finally rationalization. Each stage was entirely workable and offered clear leverage. However, the Australian prisoners displayed absolutely no emotional spectrum at all during their lengthy interrogation sessions. According to the translated Chinese report, the Australians sat comfortably in what the interrogator accurately called a dead space. They were not overtly hostile, they were not actively cooperative, and they were completely unreadable to trained psychological experts. They deliberately answered pointed questions with casual questions of their own, and they deflected intense pressure with a dry humor that instantly disrupted the interrogation room's carefully constructed power dynamic. They treated the dreaded interrogator not as a terrifying authority figure holding the power of life and death, but rather as an equal, or even slightly less than an equal. They managed this extraordinary feat without ever saying so directly or explicitly breaking military protocol. The disrespect was entirely ambient, filling the freezing room without ever being precisely locatable by the frustrated guards. You need to sit carefully with that specific phrase, ambient disrespect, to understand its true power. It was not performed, and it was certainly not theatrical, like the exaggerated Hollywood version where the heroic prisoner violently spits in the interrogator's face and gets brutally beaten for his brave defiance. That kind of loud, physical resistance is actually remarkably easy for a trained professional to handle safely. Overt physical defiance is highly emotional, which means it is inherently manipulable by an expert interrogator seeking psychological leverage. The uniquely Australian version was infinitely worse, because it was entirely atmospheric and impossible to punish effectively. The interrogator could physically feel it suffocating the room, but he could not point to a specific word, a specific hand gesture, or a specific moment and claim that was where the prisoner defied him. The Australian had not defied him at all. He had simply not acknowledged him. There is a massive operational difference between defiance and complete, crushing indifference. Every interrogator in that brutal camp learned the hard way that indifference cannot be systematically broken. How did this bizarre psychological armor happen, and where did it genuinely come from? Picture the young kid on the isolated sheep station, barely 7 years old, standing in the dust. His exhausted father looks down and asks him a direct, slightly accusatory question. "Did you leave the paddock gate open?" The kid knows two crucial things instantly without having to think. First, his father already knows the correct answer. Second, eagerly saying yes or defensively saying no will not help him. Explaining the complicated situation will definitely not help either. So the smart kid chooses a different path entirely. He simply shrugs his small shoulders, looks down at his dusty work boots, and says absolutely nothing. Or perhaps he mutters something completely sideways. "Gate was dodgy anyway," he whispers, and then quietly waits for whatever punishment comes next without flinching or crying. He does not know it yet, but he is actively rehearsing for a high-stakes Chinese interrogation room 20 years in the future. He is slowly learning to become the impenetrable gray man through daily, mundane social survival. He is learning the vital lesson that the person loudly asking the question does not automatically deserve a satisfying answer. He is learning that uncomfortable silence is not actually uncomfortable at all. Silence is just silence, an empty space waiting to be filled by the other person's rising anxiety. The gray man is exactly what the frustrated interrogators called this archetype, even without using that specific English term in their native reports. The psychological phenomenon they meticulously described maps exactly onto what modern military resistance doctrine would much later formalize globally as the highly effective gray man approach. This concept describes the ultimate prisoner who gives absolutely nothing away to his captors, offering neither active resistance nor weak cooperation. He presents a perfectly flat emotional surface with no sharp edges, no visible handles, and no psychological purchase for the enemy to grab. The gray man does not foolishly argue, does not desperately plead for his life, does not attempt to negotiate terms, and does not perform fake bravery or display genuine fear. He merely sits in the hard wooden chair, he waits patiently for time to pass, and he says as little as humanly possible. He is, in professional intelligence terms, a completely closed psychological system that cannot be externally hacked. The Americans occasionally produced naturally gifted gray men, and the British rarely produced them among their lower enlisted ranks. However, the Australians produced them organically at a massive rate that the Chinese intelligence analysts found statistically anomalous and deeply troubling. One captured enemy report highlighted a staggering historical detail that completely stops you in your tracks when analyzing the data. It noted the astonishing failure rate of their best interrogation teams when dealing specifically with these remarkably stubborn men from down under. Out of 32 Australian prisoners processed through one specific prison camp over a 6-month period in 1952, the team classified 27 as non-productive. That was their official bureaucratic category for stubborn prisoners who yielded absolutely no actionable military intelligence despite enduring multiple intense questioning sessions. 27 out of 32 men equates to an unbelievable 84% failure rate for the interrogators. The comparable American figure for that exact same detention facility across roughly the same time period, using a much larger sample size of 141 captured soldiers, was only 39% classified as completely non-productive. This massive statistical gap, 84% versus 39%, terrified the enemy intelligence network. The Australians had received significantly less formal resistance training than the American soldiers, yet they were vastly superior at withholding information. The Chinese analysts noticed this glaring discrepancy, and the behavioral patterns were heavily documented, cross-referenced, and eventually compiled into classified instructional materials. They took what was offered, they gave nothing back, and they did not appear to feel conflicted about it. The entire Chinese interrogation model collapsed, leaving the enemy desperate for a new strategy as the wars shifted south towards Vietnam's jungles. Now take that psychological evolution forward, pulling it entirely out of the freezing Korean peninsula and dropping it directly into the next brutal conflict. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong interrogation methodology in Vietnam was vastly different from the refined Chinese approach. It was demonstrably harder, possessing significantly less psychological sophistication, and demonstrating a much greater willingness to utilize severe physical coercion. The famous lenient policy was occasionally employed, but their interrogation culture was younger, far less refined, and eagerly willing to use intense physical pain as a primary tool for extracting military secrets. Against this violently aggressive approach, formal military training naturally mattered significantly more than it previously had. A captured soldier who had been explicitly taught how to desperately manage physical pain, rapidly compartmentalize sensitive secrets, and invent plausible cover stories possessed a tangible survival advantage. However, historical records reveal that something else completely unexpected counted far more. Captured classified documents from diligent North Vietnamese intelligence units actively operating in Phuoc Tuy province prominently featured deeply frustrated assessments of captured Australian military personnel. These astonishing historical documents read exactly like baffled field reports from a dedicated intelligence team that simply could not logically understand why their brutal methods were completely failing. One meticulously translated assessment desperately noted that the captured Australian soldiers consistently responded to violent threats with what the confused analyst officially described as inappropriate emotional reactions. They casually laughed at grave threats. They cheerfully made dry jokes, and they relentlessly asked the furious interrogator highly personal questions about his private life. One legendary Australian soldier sat casually during a terrifying session that was explicitly supposed to be rapidly escalating towards severe physical coercion. Instead of showing the expected mounting terror, he calmly leaned forward and politely asked his visibly angry interrogator whether he had a girlfriend waiting at home. "Have you got a miss, mate? You look like you could really use a night off." The deeply confused interrogator abruptly ended the tense session and immediately ordered the prisoner removed. The interrogation was forcefully terminated, not because the casual question was inherently offensive to his political ideology, but simply because it was profoundly disorienting. The entire psychological architecture of a successful interrogation depends absolutely on maintaining rigid power dynamics at all times. The trained interrogator must hold absolute, terrifying power over the captive. The isolated prisoner must fundamentally lack any semblance of power. Everything carefully arranged in that gloomy room reinforces that horrifying asymmetry to break the captive's spirit. The deliberate positioning of the wooden chairs, the harsh, blinding lighting, the looming presence of armed guards, and the aggressive tone of the questions all exist solely to maintain dominance. When a battered prisoner suddenly asks the stern interrogator a highly personal question in a perfectly relaxed tone, the fundamental asymmetry violently inverts for a terrifying moment. It might only be for a tiny fraction of a second, but in that fraction, the captive seizes absolute psychological control. The trained interrogator is suddenly no longer in absolute command of the small room's volatile emotional temperature. The furious interrogator knows this immediately, and the smiling prisoner clearly knows that the interrogator knows it. The Australian combat soldiers deployed this devastating psychological tactic almost instinctively during their darkest hours. They certainly did not do it successfully every single time, but they managed it with a striking frequency that the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong interrogators found completely destabilizing. The enemy intelligence officers found this completely casual behavior so utterly disruptive that they felt compelled to document it formally in their official reports. The casually deployed humor was absolutely the worst part of the entire ordeal for the highly disciplined interrogators. You can easily handle a terrified prisoner who cries softly in the dark out of sheer desperation. You can professionally handle a broken prisoner who screams loudly under the intense application of extreme physical pressure. You can even handle a stubborn prisoner who sits endlessly in stoic, unresponsive silence while mentally reciting his military serial number. But a captured prisoner who actually makes you involuntarily laugh, that is a catastrophic breach of the rigid interrogation framework. Because the exact moment the stern interrogator involuntarily laughs, the vulnerable prisoner has successfully established a genuine, undeniable human connection. Once that vital human connection firmly exists, the interrogator's professional ability to escalate violence diminishes rapidly. The dedicated intelligence officer has inadvertently shared a spontaneous moment of genuine amusement with this battered enemy soldier. The captive man is instantly no longer just a faceless, worthless object of imperialist war. He is abruptly transformed back into a highly relatable human being. Escalation feels fundamentally and deeply different when you are violently escalating against a real person you have just shared a genuine joke with. The psychological barrier to inflicting severe pain becomes significantly higher. The stubborn Australian soldiers never explicitly planned this highly sophisticated psychological maneuver during their deployment. They were definitely not coldly executing a classified military technique carefully memorized in an elite training facility. They were simply being their authentic, unfiltered selves in the absolute most extreme and terrifying circumstances imaginable. And their authentic selves proved to be the absolute ultimate defensive weapon against systemic psychological destruction, baffling their captors entirely. That unique Australian personality was intensely laconic, deeply irreverent, casually egalitarian, and constitutionally incapable of ever treating anyone as an absolute authority figure. This combination miraculously happened to be the single worst psychological profile an ambitious interrogator could ever possibly face in a locked room. They naturally possessed an invincible cultural armor that could somehow magically deflect the most brutal physical threats with a perfectly timed, culturally ingrained smirk. You can handle a prisoner who screams. You can handle a prisoner who sits in stoic silence. But a prisoner who makes you laugh, that is a catastrophic breach of the interrogation framework. This profound realization slowly rippled through the enemy's hidden intelligence networks across the war-torn province. They were slowly beginning to understand that violently breaking a man's body was relatively simple, but successfully breaking a resilient nation's deeply ingrained cultural identity was practically impossible. The baffled North Vietnamese commanders repeatedly reviewed the frustrating transcripts of these incredibly bizarre interrogation sessions. They desperately searched for hidden codes, secret military ciphers, or any logical explanation for this consistently irrational behavior under extreme duress. They simply could not fathom why a bleeding, isolated soldier facing imminent execution would waste his precious breath asking a communist political officer for relationship advice. The sheer absurdity of the conversational exchange completely short-circuited their rigid ideological training. This fundamental clash of deeply ingrained cultures created a surreal psychological battlefield inside those sweltering bamboo prisons. The Viet Cong interrogators were heavily indoctrinated with strict communist dogma, operating within a very rigid, humorless, and highly structured ideological hierarchy. They expected complete subservience, desperate pleading, or at least stubborn ideological defiance from their imperialist captives. Instead, they received a uniquely relaxed, almost friendly form of complete disrespect that essentially mocked the entire grim situation. An American prisoner might passionately argue the political merits of democracy, providing the interrogator with an easy ideological target to aggressively attack. A British soldier might rigidly demand his fundamental human rights under the Geneva Convention, giving the captor a formal legal structure to cruelly deny. But the Australian soldier simply smiled through split lips and asked if anyone had a cold beer hiding in the back room. You cannot effectively terrorize a man who refuses to take you seriously. The interrogator's immense power completely relies on the terrified prisoner, validating that power through visible fear or desperate submission. By casually treating the deadly interrogation as a mildly annoying inconvenience, the Australian captive actively stripped the interrogator of his terrifying aura. The physical pain was undoubtedly real, and the Australians certainly suffered terribly in those dark jungle camps. But they somehow mentally detached the physical suffering from the psychological submission that the captors desperately craved. They essentially built an impenetrable mental fortress using nothing but dry sarcasm and a refusal to acknowledge the captor's social dominance. It was a spectacular display of passive-aggressive psychological warfare, executed flawlessly by young men who had absolutely no idea they were deploying advanced resistance tactics. They thought they were just surviving the only way they knew how, by dragging the terrifying enemy down to their own remarkably grounded, distinctly unimpressed level of social interaction. This incredible phenomenon completely rewrote the established rules of combat interrogation within that specific theater of war. The enemy intelligence officers were forced to completely reevaluate their approach because their standard escalation of violence was yielding increasingly diminishing returns. Beating a prisoner who responds to the violent beating with a sarcastic comment about your throwing arm does not provide actionable military intelligence. It only leaves the frustrated interrogator feeling incredibly foolish and fundamentally powerless. In the brutal mathematics of wartime intelligence gathering, this unique cultural immunity was an absolute disaster for the enemy forces. Every single hour utterly wasted trying to logically comprehend a casually joking Australian was a vital hour lost. They slowly realized that trying to forcefully extract sensitive secrets from these perpetually unimpressed men was like trying to punch a dense cloud of smoke. The profound cultural gap was simply too vast to ever bridge successfully. Let us go deeper into the precise mechanics of this psychological warfare. There are 4 fundamental pillars of interrogation, resistance, and every modern military doctrine recognizes them in some specific form. First is the absolute control of information, where the prisoner must not reveal more than his basic name, rank, serial number, and date of birth. Second is strict emotional regulation, ensuring the prisoner does not display fear, burning anger, or quiet desperation in ways that give the interrogator crucial leverage. Third is counter-rapport, and fourth is long-term physical endurance. The Australians were naturally strong on all 4 pillars, but they were absolutely supernaturally strong on the first 3. Regarding the strict control of information, the Australian habit of minimum communication was not a result of classified resistance training. It was simply a regular Tuesday. If you ask an Australian farmer a direct question about how his vital crop is doing, he will look at the sky, look back at you, and just say, yeah. The information economy of rural Australia operated on the core principle that words genuinely cost something. These tough rural men learned very early to spend their limited words incredibly carefully in everyday life. When professional interrogators asked probing questions, they received answers so profoundly minimal that they could not logically determine whether the captive was deliberately withholding classified information or simply had absolutely nothing more to say. This constant, maddening ambiguity became their ultimate defensive weapon. They instinctively weaponized their natural brevity, turning mundane conversational habits into an impenetrable psychological shield that effectively neutralized the enemy's most sophisticated questioning techniques across multiple grueling hours of isolation. The second critical pillar is emotional regulation, which was deeply ingrained in Australian men of the mid-20th century. This is a sharp cultural observation rather than a glowing compliment, as they were rigidly trained by their harsh social environment to completely suppress visible emotion in almost all circumstances. Public anger was barely acceptable in certain tightly controlled contexts, but genuine grief, visible fear, and crippling anxiety were absolutely forbidden. A man who openly displayed emotional distress in a public setting was instantly diminished within his tight-knit local working-class community. While this severe emotional suppression is certainly not healthy or admirable as a general human trait, as an interrogation resistance characteristic, it was absolutely devastating to the enemy. The highly trained interrogators simply could not read these stoic men under any circumstances. The predictable emotional spectrum that the Chinese officers had mapped so incredibly effectively with the terrified American prisoners simply did not ever appear. The Australians calmly sat in that terrifying dead space, maintaining a perfectly flat, completely unreadable demeanor, stubbornly giving absolutely nothing away to their captors. Counter-rapport was the third crucial pillar, and this was where the captive Australians existed in a completely separate category of their own making. The famous lenient policy, the overly friendly interrogator, the generous offer of a premium cigarette, and the incredibly soft questions about home all depended on one massive assumption. Every single technique designed to build dangerous rapport depended completely on the fundamental belief that the isolated prisoner, at some deep subconscious level, desperately wanted to connect with another living human being to escape his crushing loneliness. The harsh isolation and extreme stress of military captivity supposedly created a massive hunger for basic human contact that the clever interrogator could easily exploit. However, the stubborn Australians genuinely did not seem to possess that specific hunger at all. Or rather, they certainly had it, but they completely satisfied it through deep bonds with each other. Their legendary mateship dynamic provided all the necessary social contact the exhausted prisoners ever needed to survive. The friendly enemy interrogator was absolutely never needed or wanted for that critical psychological function. Furthermore, their deeply ingrained cultural suspicion of traditional authority figures created an impenetrable psychological barrier. Anyone who actively holds arbitrary power over you is to be deeply mistrusted until proven otherwise, and usually long after that as well. This meant the smiling interrogator was instantly pre-categorized as a treacherous adversary, regardless of how incredibly friendly he behaved. While a vulnerable American prisoner might begin to see the lenient captor as a genuine ally or a vital lifeline, the skeptical Australian prisoner viewed him exactly like a dishonest used car salesman. The fourth vital pillar, endurance, was precisely where formal military training mattered the most, and the Australians suffered terribly just like anyone else. They were frail human beings trapped in brutal captivity, and prolonged captivity slowly grinds everyone down into dust. Under severe, prolonged physical and psychological pressure, a small percentage of them eventually cracked. However, the frustrated interrogators noted that even the ones who finally broke did so in a remarkably different manner than their American counterparts. When an American prisoner's resistance finally broke, the psychological dam completely burst. The previously withheld information came rushing out in an overwhelming flood, sometimes providing significantly more data than the surprised interrogator even wanted to hear. The broken prisoner, having finally made the agonizing decision to cooperate, seemed to desperately need to legally justify it by being excessively thorough and intensely helpful. In sharp contrast, the very few Australian prisoners who eventually broke only gave the absolute bare minimum. Even in total defeat, they were incredibly stubborn misers, begrudgingly handing over a useless unit number or a completely outdated geographical location. They stubbornly doled out highly fragmented military information like a reluctant stockman slowly paying for a remarkably expensive round of drinks at the local pub. They surrendered details extremely reluctantly, intensely, specifically, and absolutely never sent one single ounce more than was strictly necessary to survive the immediate beating. One highly frustrated Chinese interrogator accurately described the agonizing process as trying to interrogate a stubborn man through a heavily locked door with a tiny slot. You could forcefully push your demanding questions right through the narrow metal slot. Occasionally, a very small, entirely useless piece of paper came sliding back through that tiny slot. You would never see the heavy door actually opening, and you would never get the full, comprehensive picture of the battlefield. The interrogator only ever received grudging, minimal fragments that required 3 exhausting sessions just to logically assemble into a single, barely useful paragraph of military intelligence. Even their ultimate failure under torture was incredibly stubborn and deeply unrewarding for the furious intelligence officers desperately trying to map the massive Allied combat deployments. Here is what the enemy intelligence apparatus truly feared the most: the total absence of any predictable psychological pattern. Every single Australian prisoner seemingly operated from the exact same cultural baseline of laconic, deflective disrespect. However, the specific way each captive man actively expressed this rebellion was remarkably different enough that the frustrated interrogators simply could not develop a standardized counter-approach. One stubborn man used dry humor, another used dead silence, while a third captive pretended he genuinely could not logically understand the screaming interpreter standing right beside him. A fifth man boldly gave answers so absurdly literal that the interrogator could never determine whether he was being mocked or if the prisoner was just stupid. Asked about the exact strength of his combat unit, one Australian casually replied, "Pretty strong, mate. Good blokes." When aggressively pressed for exact numbers, he merely shrugged and said, "A few, more than a couple." The exhausting session lasted 90 minutes, yielding absolutely zero actionable intelligence. The prisoner cooperated fully and revealed nothing. That sentence is the entire story, perfectly compressed into 7 words. The prisoner had calmly sat in the wooden chair, politely responded to every single question, maintained steady eye contact, and had never been openly defiant. He had brilliantly given the perfect appearance of a totally cooperative prisoner to any senior officer observing silently through the glass window, yet he had miraculously delivered absolutely zero usable military intelligence. The enemy interrogators were completely paralyzed by this flawless performance. They slowly realized you simply cannot forcefully train that level of organic defiance into a man. It must be born into his blood. How do you train that kind of flawless resistance? You simply do not. That is the entire point of this fascinating historical anomaly. The determined Americans certainly tried their absolute best. They built massive survival schools and designed the complex SEER program to artificially manufacture exactly this specific kind of psychological resistance. And the SEER program undeniably works in practice. It consistently produces disciplined soldiers who can perform remarkably well under extreme interrogation pressure. However, calculated performance and ingrained personality are 2 entirely different psychological entities. A trained soldier is merely acting. The highly trained soldier is essentially just executing a memorized military doctrine. His intensive training explicitly tells him to give minimal information, to remain completely emotionally neutral, and to aggressively avoid building any rapport. He follows the strict training perfectly. He does it remarkably well in captivity. But the experienced interrogator can almost always sense the forced performance, the immense mental effort, and the fragile discipline holding the artificial behavior in place. And human discipline can inevitably be eroded over time. Time slowly erodes it. Physical pain aggressively erodes it. Sleep deprivation constantly erodes it. Severe isolation systematically erodes that artificial discipline until the vulnerable man underneath finally emerges. The Australian captive, however, was absolutely not performing a trained routine. He was simply being himself in a highly stressful environment. There was absolutely no artificial discipline to slowly erode because there was zero discipline required in the first place. The casual man who answered "pretty strong, mate" was not executing a highly classified counter-interrogation technique. He was literally just talking the exact same way he talked to everyone in every single mundane situation back in his civilian life. He spoke to the hostile interrogator identically to how he addressed the prison guard, his military mates, or the bloke at the hardware store back home. The confusing answer would have been exactly the same regardless of the specific context because the casual answer came directly from the man, not from his training manual. A grown man's fundamental personality simply does not erode under pressure. You can aggressively suppress it, and you can severely damage it physically, but you absolutely cannot peel it away to magically reveal a more cooperative, submissive person hiding underneath. Under the captured Australian's incredibly laconic exterior was absolutely not a frightened, vulnerable man desperately waiting to cooperate with his captors. Under the remarkably laconic exterior was simply more impenetrable laconic exterior. It went all the way down to his very core. This is exactly what the frustrated intelligence officers across multiple bloody conflicts, across multiple opposing armies, and across multiple decades kept repeatedly running into like a brick wall. It was not a rehearsed military resistance. It was a deeply ingrained national identity. And cultural identity is the one thing an interrogation cannot defeat. You literally cannot defeat a culture without violently destroying the captive person entirely. The North Vietnamese intelligence apparatus understood this profound reality eventually, though not conceptually. They certainly did not sit around writing detailed academic papers about complex Australian cultural psychology. But operationally, they pragmatically adapted their battlefield strategies. The warning words slowly filtered through their vast clandestine interrogation networks operating deep within Phuoc Tuy province. The Australians naturally require significantly more sessions, consume far more time, and consistently produce drastically less actionable intelligence per session than any other captured nationality in the entire theater. They provided significantly less actionable intelligence per session than absolutely any other participating nationality in the war. Not just the heavily targeted Americans, but anyone else involved. The South Koreans, the tough Thai contingent, the New Zealanders, literally everyone. The resilient Australians were consistently anchored at the very bottom of the enemy's intelligence productivity chart. This naturally meant they were sitting proudly at the absolute top of the resistance chart, despite having the least formal training in resistance to interrogation of any major Western military force currently deployed in the humid jungles of Vietnam. Consider exactly what that astonishing statistical reality truly means. From the frustrated interrogator's strategic side, you are a dedicated intelligence officer. Your primary military job is to efficiently extract vital information to save your comrades. You possess a strictly limited number of waking hours, a severely limited number of trained interrogators, and a limited number of sessions you can conduct before the battered prisoner is abruptly transferred, officially exchanged, or the fluid tactical battlefield situation violently changes. Every single hour you completely waste on an unproductive prisoner is a massive tactical failure. It is a precious hour you are actively not spending successfully breaking a highly productive captive. The stubborn Australians were simply a terrible logistical investment for the enemy intelligence network. The pragmatic enemy commanders slowly started to realize this undeniable mathematical fact. It did not happen immediately, but gradually over the long course of the brutal Vietnam deployment. North Vietnamese intelligence officers operating in the southern provinces actively adjusted their processing priorities whenever a mixed tactical group of unlucky prisoners was successfully captured during a chaotic jungle ambush or a massive coordinated assault. Whether it was a mixed group of captured Australians and Americans, or Australians and South Vietnamese troops, the operational directive was clear. The frustrating Australians were strategically interrogated last, exceedingly briefly, or sometimes absolutely not at all. One beautifully captured enemy directive explicitly instructed their field interrogators to heavily focus their limited resources on the American and Allied prisoners. First, whenever Australian prisoners of war were currently present in the secret camp. This was precisely the historic document that proud Australian intelligence analysts excitedly brought up in official military briefings for decades afterward. The formal justification was specifically grounded on the undeniable grounds that the Australians required entirely disproportionate effort for absolutely minimal intelligence yield. Disproportionate effort for minimal yield. The actual enemy literally wrote that astonishing conclusion down in black and white. It was not proudly written by the Australian military, not printed on a flashy recruiting poster, and not spoken by a dramatic documentary narrator. The determined enemy, in their own highly classified internal communications to their own frontline officers, freely admitted that interrogating captured Australians was a complete and utter waste of time. There is absolutely no higher compliment a formal interrogation resistance program could ever possibly receive from an opposing force. Except, of course, this legendary resistance was not actually a military program at all. This was simply the country itself manifesting in a locked room. The final, definitive word on this incredible phenomenon belongs directly to the defeated enemy, as it almost always does in this type of story. A captured North Vietnamese intelligence officer, thoroughly debriefed shortly after the chaotic fall of Saigon, was asked directly about historical interrogation outcomes across the various nationalities. He carefully provided incredibly detailed historical assessments that were highly professional and deeply analytical. It was exactly the kind of refreshing post-war honesty that only genuinely comes when the bitter war is finally over and there is absolutely nothing left to passionately protect. He calmly stated that the American captives were undeniably brave but remained psychologically readable. He noted that the fierce South Korean soldiers were physically tough but emotionally brittle. They were incredibly hard to start breaking, but once they cracked completely and spilled absolutely everything to their captors. He accurately observed that the Thai combat soldiers were generally quiet and eventually cooperative under sustained pressure. He said the captured New Zealanders were culturally very similar to the Australians, but perhaps slightly less extreme in their casual defiance. Then the Allied officers directly asked him about the Australians specifically. The veteran interrogator paused thoughtfully, remembering those deeply frustrating sessions in the sweltering jungle camps. Then he quietly gave a profound answer that the attending Australian liaison officer diligently wrote down verbatim and proudly carried in his personal notebook for his entire career. The Australians, we quickly learned not to waste our precious time on them. They would just sit comfortably in the chair and stare blankly at you, and you literally could not tell if they were terrified, completely bored, genuinely stupid, or vastly smarter than you. They answered your aggressive questions with absolutely nothing. Not angry refusal, just pure nothing. It was exactly like interrogating the weather. You could aggressively ask all the questions you liked. The weather simply does not care. The weather absolutely does not care about your petty military authority. It was exactly like interrogating the weather. You could ask all the questions you liked. The weather simply does not care. That profoundly beautiful conclusion is the entire historical story. It was never about superior military training, complex psychological doctrine, a classified government program, or an elite survival school. It was an entire culture that thoroughly taught its young men, from the dusty rural cradle straight to the terrifying interrogation room, that the demanding person aggressively asking the question is absolutely never automatically entitled to receive a satisfying answer under any circumstances. It was a deeply ingrained social belief that complete silence is not inherently rude, that assumed authority does not automatically demand genuine respect, and that giving the absolute bare minimum is always perfectly enough. The terrified enemy interrogators undeniably confirmed this cultural phenomenon through their own repeated, agonizing failures across multiple generations of warfare. The unbreakable Australian grey man remains a spectacular historical anomaly, a magnificent testament to the sheer defensive power of profound cultural indifference when facing the absolute darkest depths of organized human cruelty and psychological manipulation. The incredibly fascinating aspect of this entire historical narrative is how it perfectly highlights the immense limitations of rigid, standardized military intelligence doctrines. The highly educated Chinese and North Vietnamese psychological warfare experts possessed flawlessly designed theoretical models that had successfully broken thousands of brave men before. They systematically relied on predictable human desires for basic comfort, intense social connection, and clear hierarchical structures. Yet, their meticulously crafted scientific frameworks completely shattered when they forcefully collided with a rugged, working-class culture that fundamentally rejected every single one of those underlying psychological assumptions. This profound historical lesson resonates deeply within modern intelligence circles even today. You can spend millions of dollars meticulously training a highly disciplined soldier how to artificially resist sophisticated interrogation techniques, but you can never truly replicate the impenetrable armor of genuine, lifelong cultural indifference. The legendary Australian grey man did not survive those horrific prison camps because he was vastly stronger or remarkably braver than his deployed American or British counterparts. He simply survived because his deeply cynical worldview effectively immunized his mind against the specific psychological poisons the interrogators were using. As we close this incredible historical chapter, the haunting image of the casual Australian soldier sitting in a freezing room, politely asking his furious captor about the weather, remains absolutely unforgettable. It brilliantly encapsulates the ultimate triumph of authentic human identity over systemic psychological destruction. The massive intelligence machines of powerful opposing nations were completely neutralized by a simple, dusty shrug and a casually delivered mate. The enemy learned the hardest lesson of all. You cannot possibly break a stubborn man who refuses to acknowledge that he is even participating in your game.